Because we don't have elders, or we don't have teachers, we don't have gurus in this culture. We don't have somebody balls of light, alcohol, TV, balls of light. You know, we do a lot of drugs. We drink a lot of alcohol, opiates, focus that energy. Paranormal experiences.
So much Mothman activity.
Paranormal experiences. Balls of light. If you want to see them as angels, you'll see them as angels. If you want to see them as aliens, you'll see them as aliens. Watch TV. Yeah, it's energy. Round, purple balls of light. You know, we do a lot of drugs. Energy. Watch TV.
Balls of light.
Yoga or through meditation. Alcohol and TV. Yoga or through meditation, focus that energy. Yoga or through meditation, alcohol or TV. Yoga or through meditation, balls of light.
Part of a nationwide occult group.
Killing each other left and right.
So much Mothman activity.
Watch TV. Yeah, it's energy.
A nationwide occult group.
The battle of good and evil.
6 years after the Mothman.
Watch TV.
Balls of light. He pulled one of the key Mothman experiencers out of her. He tried to pull her into his car.
Paranormal experiences. Round purple balls of light.
So much Mothman activity.
Round purple energy. Balls of light. If you want to see them as angels, you'll see them as angels. If you want to see them as aliens, you'll see them as aliens. Focus that energy. The battle of good and evil. Paranormal experiences. The battle of good and evil. Watch TV.
Balls of light.
The most important question is whether you perceive the world as one of good or one of evil.
All right, welcome to another segment of Beyond the Grassy Knoll. We have Andrew Colvin with us today, and that's not really an extraordinary thing, but we have with us also Robert Denton Jr., who contacted me because he had been listening to some of Andrew's shows, and you'll understand why he would be motivated to contact me, and also wanted to speak to Andrew, and we're going to do that today. So with us from the great state of New Jersey is Robert Denton Jr.
Virginia, actually.
Oh, man, you got me confused. You know, I didn't check the area code, and I thought, okay, you do have a foot in Jersey, don't you?
It's where I was born and raised.
Okay, that's why you're on the show.
There you go.
People from New Jersey get special privilege. Everybody else seems to be from Washington State or Canada. I can't figure that out. But Robert Denton Jr., he's a geologist, but there's something interesting about this. I mean, that's a pretty hard science, excuse the pun. But as he's admitted, and we'll hear more about today, although he is definitely very, very deep into the discipline, I guess you could say there's an intuitive nature in him that also has revealed much to him, and we'll hear about that. That may not be a perspective that you would find most geologists taking. But now, having said that, with Andrew out in Washington State and Robert in Virginia, Rob, why don't you tell us how this all came about?
Oh, well, it is, I think I was listening to several of the shows, and had been interested until when a friend of mine kind of turned me on to your broadcast, and then of course Andy's interest in the Mothman research, and the Mound region of West Virginia, which is something that always kind of intrigued me. That's what really kind of piqued my curiosity, because I had never really heard anybody talking about this before, other than reading about it, perhaps in Pete Levenda's books.
And actually, geographically, when we do talk about, or he actually is visiting the Ohio River Valley up around West Virginia and Ohio, I mean, that's kind of an area that you share some kind of propinquity with as well, don't you?
Yes. Well, where I am, I mean, my work is, and where I live is in the Shenandoah Valley, but we're on the kind of the east side of West Virginia. I do a lot of work in the Eastern Panhandle, what's known as the Eastern Panhandle of West Virginia, which is out there in the Martinsburg area and
Shepherdstown, I guess.
Shepherdstown,
yeah.
Charlestown, that region. And what's always intrigued me is how things really change as you cross the state of West Virginia, and you have to kind of be from around here. Now, I'm sure Andy's well aware of this. When you cross kind of the spine of the Appalachians and you sort of descend down into the Ohio River Valley in the Monongahela area and that region, things are very different. And we're not, and I'm not just talking about I mean, obviously that's a very economically depressed area. And, I mean, there's one little town, I remember when we went out to Moundsville last year, there was one little town we came through, and I think it was Fairmont, if I'm not mistaken, where their town hall was up for sale, which it just completely shocked me. I mean, it was one of these things like, good Lord, they're selling the town hall.
Well, are you saying there's a bit of a culture shift from
very much so.
Once you cross over the Blue Ridge? Yep,
very much so. But that's sort of I don't know how to describe it. That's sort of it's kind of like macrocosm and microcosm, the outward expression in a sense. But the thing that's really weird, and this is kind of getting into what I guess we're going to talk a little bit more about later, is there is a very different, for lack of a better term, a vibe, a different energy that in that area.
Okay.
And it's something that's very difficult to put your finger on. And Andy, having been kind of raised out there, lived his, I guess what, Andy, your early life in that region. You would have your finger on that pulse probably even better than I do, but I know coming into that area, I don't want to say it's not, to say it's disturbing is probably too strong of a word, but there's a very
unsettling,
different
shall we
energy.
Say unsettling? Would that be?
Yeah, it's unsettling. It's almost, I mean, just to give you an idea, we went to visit the Grave Creek Mound in Moundsville, West Virginia. It was just, I guess it was last year or the year before. And this is the largest of all the known, or all the, I shouldn't say known, all the remaining mounds from the Adena culture. And when we got there, one of the things that struck us was the fact that here's this enormous Adena mound, reasonably well preserved. They built a brand new museum to it's kind of to feature the mound itself as like a visitor center. But more people who go to Moundsville, and it's hard to imagine people going to Moundsville as a tourist center, but more people go to see the old state prison
yep. Mm-hmm.
in Moundsville
right.
than go to see the mound, which is one of the things. It's kind of, and that sort of speaks volumes, in a sense.
Well, that prison has a history too, doesn't it?
Oh yeah,
yeah. And I think Andrew, did we not talk about that prison, if not on air, off air?
It seems like we did. I went there when I was doing the reality series and shot some footage. I don't know that I used it, but I've been there.
Well, think back to perhaps an email exchange we had that also, I think, involved a training center for prison guards that also involved the Jesuit College, I think, Wheeling. Yeah, Moundsville was one of the prisons, perhaps the most notorious in the state, no?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Doesn't Moundsville also have the Manson connection?
Well, nearby.
Okay.
McMecken there, and the Hare Krishna temple that had some murders and drug dealing and stuff is there. And it's really close to Pennsylvania, which is where Manson's mom may have met his father. If I'm correct, that it's Biddle.
Andrew, let me ask you this. If you can pump your volume a little bit.
Okay.
It'll be helpful. Thank you.
Oh, let me see.
I
can just talk closer. How's that?
That'll do it. Technically, that's as sound as anything else. All right, so let's go in go back to Robert talking about Moundsville and that section. I'm assuming that Andy hit on something that probably embodied exactly what you were feeling about the area. I mean, and that's just where we're going to start it with. So, is that an accurate statement?
Me?
Robert.
Oh. Well, I'm sorry, Viz. What was the question again?
That's okay. I'll make it a multiple choice.
Okay.
No. What I'm assuming is that what we're talking about, quote, feelings and such, and I think we can all relate to that. That a certain place, for some reason, for some of us, just isn't really a good feeling. Anyway,
right.
Was there something in any of the interviews that Andrew and I had, especially in 2008, that kind of hit you and you went like, that's what I was thinking?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's the how do you say it? The unusual thing about that whole, this region where a lot of these mounds occur seems to be, it seems to have this general energy or vibe in common, and you don't seem to experience that as profoundly when you're outside of that area. And so that's and it's interesting because there are a number of these places around the country, and the two I'm the most familiar with, very familiar with, is that greater Ohio River Valley, central West Virginia, western West Virginia area, and then another one is the of all places the central Pine Barrens of New Jersey. And these places both have something in common, which is you've got the Mothman out there in the Ohio River Valley region, and then you've got the tales of the Jersey Devil, or and there's even something that's been referred to as the pine lights, these little phosphorescent orbs that fly around in the pines, and if you read the descriptions of the Jersey Devil, it's regardless of what all the cryptozoology wonks would like to say about it, it has an awful lot in common with the Mothman. It's kind of this, again, sort of this interesting kind of a Garuda-like image, where you've got this flying creature, glowing red eyes. There's even and I wonder sometimes if it's connected in some ways to these beings that foretell disaster or some kind of danger. There's a deep tradition of that in the Pine Barrens as well too.
Let me hold you right there to a couple things, and I want to throw it to Andrew because that's a lot to chew off, and I don't want you to go too far without having him respond to it because. And well, for obvious reasons. First of all, I want to tell you this, and this is spooky, but with Andrew there, this is kind of like standard fare. I wore 3 hats today, 3 baseball caps. The third I wore for this particular interview, and my hair's getting greasy, so I wanted something really tight on it, is my New Jersey Devil hat. So, I don't know. There it goes. Secondly, I just wanted to say to you about that Appalachian area, and I think you and I emailed a little bit about it. I mean, I've been up and down the Appalachians from Maine, New Hampshire, probably as far as the Carolina, Virginia border.
Goes clear down Alabama.
Right. But I'm going to say one thing. I mean, there's something that has always struck me about the Appalachians, and I should say more so the people who live there. And the word that always comes to mind is impenetrable. I don't know why, but that's, there's something going on there. But also, Andy, let me throw it to you because when Robert first contacted me, I think I shared an email about that, and I just sent you one recently. But that first one, do you remember, if you can think back then, some of the things that you kind of felt similarly about?
About exactly what now?
The information that I first sent to you, and you may have forgotten it to a certain extent, but if you remember your feelings about it, were rather positive that Robert's onto something, or you share some kind of common feelings about the area, which led you were the one that revived the idea that we were going to do a show with Robert. That's when you were on the road. And I'll tell you that temporarily slipped my mind. And when you said it, I was like, holy mackerel, that's right. So you were aware of the fact that that he had some, shall we say, intuitive or earth-sensitive impressions about your old stomping grounds.
Yes. Yeah. And I wanted to, before we move on, I wanted to say something about the Grave Creek Mound, though. Did Bob mention that it was the largest mound, Adena Mound?
Yes.
Okay. There's I looked up the stone. There was a famous stone found in there, had writing on it, and I just found a reference to it. That someone named Barry Fell wrote a book in 1976 about it called America BC, but he claimed to have translated that stone. There's some controversy about what the stone says, but he said it was Iberian, which has come up before in lots of places. A lot of the interesting scripts that I've found or other people have told me about seeing in places seem to be an old Iberian script. And this one's supposed to be Punic, and it says the mound raised on high for Tassach, T-A-C-A-C-H, this tile his queen caused to be made. And I think some people may and he also says that Fell is taking, this guy's a linguist of some sort. He says that Fell is reading it as the letter Shin, the Semitic word Shin. Although this person writing the critique doesn't agree with that, that's what Fell was doing. He was seeing the word Shin in there, which I've mentioned several times on the show, as being the old word that means spirit, and and the word and the name of China and the Shinto religion, and all these words come from it. And the actual letter has a lot of meaning, the symbol of how you write it. And it's also, I think, probably in the root of the word Shenandoah Valley, in a way, because it's sometimes spelled with an E instead of an I.
Right. Yeah, and in fact we don't know. See, that's one of the. I'm glad you mentioned that, Andy, because that's one of the real mysteries of the Shenandoah Valley. Is we don't know where the name actually came from, and you see references to the so-called Sanedo tribe, who were apparently made extinct essentially before the Shawnee even made their incursions into this region as a result of all the tumult by the white occupation. But we don't know. It's really a mystery. So that's an interesting possibility.
Yeah, in one map that I have seen of the old tribes, they called the ones in eastern West Virginia and the Shenandoah, the Manahoac. Is another Mon word.
Yep.
We've had several of. Yeah, go ahead. I'd like to hear.
It's interesting because the thing too that people don't realize is the mound builder culture of some or an aggrandizement of that culture, perhaps by other tribes, extended over a much wider area than people realize. There were mounds all over the Shenandoah Valley at one time, the Eastern Panhandle. In fact, one of the last remaining ones is still in a little graveyard in Romney, West Virginia. It's called Indian Mound Graveyard, and it's not very big. The mound is only perhaps 20 feet in diameter. It's maybe 8-10 feet high, something like that. But there it is, and this is apparently one of hundreds, if not thousands, of these small burial mounds that at one time were scattered over this entire area, and unfortunately, the white settlers just plowed them under or dug them up, or they've all been pretty much obliterated.
Well, that's interesting because Romney's where George Washington had his first big sort of West Virginia mansion, and and he appears to have done the same thing in near Charleston and Point Pleasant.
Right.
Because he owned all that land in between. I don't know that he actually lived there or not, but he owned it. And
that is interesting. The thing is, and this is the problem that we really have, is that so much of this stuff has been obliterated that you can't really. It's hard to figure out at one time what the extent of all this stuff was. And I mean, and back to Moundsville, if you see the original maps that were made in the early 1800s of what was there, you suddenly realize that it wasn't just Grave Creek Mound. I mean, there was an entire plaza of ceremonial structures in Moundsville. They stretched for over a half a mile. The Grave Creek Mound was kind of like the Way of the Dead in Teotihuacan. The Grave Creek Mound was kind of the crowning feature of the one end of this great plaza. But the rest of it has been pretty much obliterated and covered up by the current city of Moundsville.
Let me ask you something, Robert. When you say that traces of past civilizations have been obliterated, that's not with any particular bias there. That's just because, for the most part, development and a lack of respect for the artifacts of past civilizations.
Mm-hmm.
And Andy, you felt the same way also. Isn't that one of the things that you've mentioned too, is that it's so hard to try to, again, excuse the pun, unearth much of the past histories of the peoples that were here.
Yeah, and I do think that there appears to have been a deliberate attempt to desecrate those spots.
All right, so you feel there is a bias involved in this?
Do I feel there is?
In the obliteration of the traces.
Absolutely. I believe so.
All right, you do. Okay.
I believe there was. The white settlers, the Western European settlers, whatever you want to call them, they definitely had. Not just all the settlers, but had definitely a prejudice and a pecking order when it came to the Native American people. And it's, the nomadic ones were the worst. They tried to wipe them out as quickly as possible. And then of course the more settled people, because they're, a good example, in the Western Interior today, the tribes who are still, have probably, still high populations, still have, relatively settled lives, are the Pueblo people, the Rio Grande Pueblos, the Hopi, the Zuni. Why did they get fooled with less than let's say the Comanche, the nomadic tribes? Well, because they lived in towns.
Right.
They knew where they were.
That's right.
They knew where to find them. And so it was more familiar in a sense. But these, the remnants of an ancient culture that are there, the problem is with there's always this thing, this driving, urge with, I wasn't to say just with white Western Europeans, but I think it's people in general, is that, inside of ancient structures, there must be wonderful treasures. And so you dig into these things to find the wonderful treasure, and if you don't find them, then you're disappointed, and you just say, well, heck, let's just plow the whole thing under.
If I could, I wanted to ask something of Andrew before we get too far from it, before I lose the thought of asking such, because it gets involved with what you're talking about, and all along those river valleys in the east and into the central part of the state. Making quick work of it, Andrew, you had mentioned before there was an Iberian influence.
Yes, there's been some different scripts that have been found at spots where, say, a creature was sighted, and then for time, like there's one in the concrete here in Seattle. There's been some things in the parks that people have seen. There's Bigfoot contactees have written and taken photos of things that they've.
Speak up, Andrew, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, and it's always Iberian.
All right,
and I do think that this gets back to the Moorish thing, because that's back in those days, that was they were ruled by the Moors for hundreds of years, and the coming of in 1492 of Columbus was part of that effort to crush them, and they were driven out of Spain that year.
All right. Now, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I don't want to also create a digression that we will never return from, because
that's fine.
Well, I mean, because if I mention it, it's juicy stuff, and not necessarily. I mean, it may be juicy, it may be provocative, but it doesn't mean that it's not true. And that is, when you talk about that influence, you're talking about it being up in the Ohio River Valley. Is that correct? One of the places, at least, right?
Yes, and there always seems to be this the controversy is entered in simply, I think, because academia doesn't want to admit that fact. So they end up having all these. In the case of the Graves Creek Stone, it disappeared. Right. And it's no longer to be found.
Well, let me just throw this over to you guys, and anybody can respond. Maybe, Robert, for the sake of order, I'll have you respond first. But what I've been wanting to do, with not the greatest amount of success, though I haven't gotten real pitched about it, you're saying that there was an Iberian influence and others in the Ohio Valley. I've also never really forgotten about what has been alleged that takes place where the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi are. And, of course, the whole bit about Cairo and New Egypt out there, and being the point that could we have been very much visited through the Mississippi, through the three major river arteries, which would be the Mississippi, the Missouri, and the Ohio. I mean, and when you said something to the effect, and I know Robert's going to feel the same way, that there is a certain kind of, again, antimony directed toward anybody who would say that people were here and penetrated much deeper into the interior of this country, other than what we've been taught, leads them to try to squash, suppress any kind of information with regard to who might have been here. Now, Robert, I know that's kind of long-winded, but have you come upon any kind of evidence, and if so, any kind of resistance toward the fact that we might have had, who knows, whether we had Spanish, Portuguese, Phoenicians? Are we looking at some kind of, well, let's face it, conspiracy?
Well, I don't know if it's a conspiracy or sort of a tyranny of the intellect, if you will, for lack of a better term. There's kind of this overarching thing in academia, is that you get one person who will come forward with some idea, and it becomes a tyrannical idea in that becomes the paradigm, the existing paradigm. Okay. And a good example of this, for years and years and years, and again, going back to the Western Interior, I'm going to segue into what you mentioned, but I need to use this as an example. There was always this feeling that somehow the current Pueblo people, the Rio Grande Pueblos, the Hopi, you name it, were somehow different and not as special as what the archaeologists refer to as the Anasazi, the old ones, who built Chaco Canyon, who built the Mesa Verde. And the Rio Grande people insisted for generations. They said, no. We're the Anasazi. You don't understand. We're who built those places. We just abandoned one and moved to another for various reasons. And it wasn't until the last decade or so that, in fact, the archaeologists had this great revelation. It was you know what? It seems like they weren't lying to us all along. And it's one of these things where it's like, well, yeah, but we told you that. And one of the refreshing things, and I got a chance to actually work with some of these people, is that finally, Hopi archaeologists are now getting their graduate degrees and are working in the field, and Zuni archaeologists are working in the field, and they're bringing, a tremendous insight to us that we've never had before, because they're studying their own people, and they're, if anybody would know, that you have this nice conjunction of lore combined with good scholarly approach.
Would they also be able to bring any pressure to bear on mainstream academia and archaeology in particular?
Well, I think they are. I
Okay.
think they are, and I think that's a real important thing. That's why we're suddenly now seeing. Remember, for the other thing, and Andy, I'm sure, is aware of this. For years and years and years, there was this absolute contention in the archaeological community that there was no contact between pre-Columbian cultures, meaning the Maya, the Aztec, the Zapotec, whatever, and the mound builders in the Mississippi Valley. No contact. Never mind the fact that, Quetzal birds show up in the sculptures of both places. Never mind the fact that they're all using, ear whorls made from soapstone, that they pierce their lips, that they do all these different cultural things that are veritably identical, but they would literally stomp their feet and say, no, 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 no. There's no contact between these people. And yet now, suddenly, especially in the last decade, there's these walls of this paradigm are starting to soften up.
Okay.
And people are now starting to say, well, maybe we should rethink this whole thing. And I think, the ferocity, which with Barry Fell's stuff, and I'm very familiar with Barry's work, was attacked back in the 70s, it was unbelievable. I mean, there was people who were just, and this is a guy who was very well respected until he started writing about early incursions into North America by Europeans. And then all of a sudden it was, oh, you stepped out of the bounds, Mr. Fell. This is, you're scratching the ragged edge of blasphemy here.
Yep. Andrew, let me ask you also, we talk a lot about the prefix of mon or more. Would the Moorish influence be separate from the Iberian?
Well, I imagine there's a whole lot of variation and mixing and things that went on in the Iberian Peninsula. So, but the Moors were the sailors. That was their skill. That was what they were known for. And I think that the whole thing about Columbus was a way to co-opt that and make it Europeans, not the.
Well, do either of you have any fix on whether or not the Moorish endeavors were separate from the time before? Obviously, there was, and I don't know how far this goes back, which is why I'm asking you guys. Was there any time where, like I said, the Moorish endeavors were separate from any kind of Iberian endeavors? And because they are obviously coastal, I think I can say that correctly, that what they might have done before there was any kind of intermingling can be seen in the Western Hemisphere. Any clue on that, guys?
Well, it's all destroyed. A lot of it's been destroyed, but I imagine there's still things there for those who want to dig.
Okay,
right.
And Robert, any insight on that?
See, I tend to think of the Moors as in a sense, at least to the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal, as relative latecomers.
Right.
They really came in there, during the post-Mohammedan expansion period what would that be, about 700-800 AD. To me, the more intriguing connection is that, this culture in Iberia during the Roman era and before was known as the Celto-Iberian culture. And this is one of the things where, here's a strange little, just a weird little thing. And this occurred when I was, I had to go, the company I used to work for had some production facilities down in Puerto Rico. And we went to Puerto Rico, and I said, well, I want to get some local food, rather than food that's made for Americans. And we went out to this, was supposed to be a very good restaurant in San Juan, and guaranteed that they had local food, most of it Spanish in origin. And one of the things that was prominently featured on the menu was corned beef and cabbage. And I looked at this and I asked them, I said, "This is Spanish?" And they said, "Oh, absolutely."
Everybody's
it's a favorite dish in Spain. And suddenly the light bulb went off, and I said, It's the old Celto-Iberian connection. You know, and where would these people go? You know, it's just like we talk about the Scots-Irish. Well, why did they go to the Appalachians? To be isolated is the one excuse that's given, but I think the other excuse is because the land drew them. It was familiar. It felt familiar to them.
Sure. And the weather was rotten, so they loved it.
Mm-hmm.
Also, are you alluding to the fact, and I have not done much, I haven't done anything with this, let me just say that, but I find it extremely interesting and probably meritorious there. That is the research into what the Celtic culture might have been capable of, including doing a transatlantic voyages and being here as well, which apparently is not a real popular quote theory with the standard historians and archaeologists. Is that true? I mean,
well, it isn't a popular theory, and that's, again, this is one of the, you know, these existing paradigms. I mean, you know, and yet if you ask the same archaeologists, well, tell me a little bit about the so-called red ochre culture. This is there's a characteristic burial mode essentially in the northern hemisphere, but here the weird part about it. Let me just describe it very quickly. To give the dead the appearance that we always say, it's the blush of life. They would sprinkle the body with red ochre. It's basically a red iron oxide mineral.
Right.
This culture, though, is found completely around the whole subarctic region. It's in northern North America. It's in Greenland. It's in Norway, Scandinavia in general. It's in Siberia. It goes all the way around the whole northern hemisphere. It's not limited to one continent. And the question is, if these people weren't moving back and forth, how would this interesting little cultural feature
spread?
Get around?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know, so that's why when people say, oh, they weren't able to make that trip, I don't buy it.
We're up about 36 minutes after the hour, and first of all, Andrew, any new developments with regard to Mothman additions or anything new that you may have added? Also, would you please speak to the fact that you had a segment, you were the focus of a segment on what you do in an Italian documentary from a popular show over there that does pretty decent work.
Yeah, that was the RAI program on American Mysteries, and they had that unusual mix of 911, Mothman, Marconi, and Marilyn Monroe.
Oh, my.
That all fits.
It actually does, kind of.
I know.
Segued right from 911 into Mothman, and then had me on there talking about the prophecies of that event, floating around. It seems between amongst Mothman witnesses. Before I go on, I wanted to mention though about the Celtic thing.
Okay, sure.
That reminded me of Peter Moon's theory that I can't remember what his sources were, but that the Celts were originally in Egypt and carried, what is you could essentially call Freemasonry out of Egypt when they went to Scotland. And so in a way, when you talk about the Celts, you kind of, they have a Moorish underpinning, from being in Egypt, according to that theory. So they're kind of the same thing in a way,
right.
Especially when you go way back. I think they may have been coming a lot earlier, and it's just been, covered up. But in terms of stuff that's going on, Mothman 3, the Mothman Photographer 3 is out, and 4 is almost finished, and it'll be out soon. And in addition to going to Ohio, which we talked about on the last show, I went to Albuquerque a couple of weeks ago for a weekend, and some interesting things happened there. And so we've added 3 episodes more to the reality series. So it's up to 33 hours plus 3 extra bonus hours. And yeah, I think, I was joking with you earlier about how we've solved the Mothman riddle. And, obviously it's so vast that you can't really solve it, but the framework is really there. It's fallen into place, and it's sort of, a lot of it happened on this trip to Albuquerque, where we visited some reservations, and the stuff about the mountains started to make a whole lot more sense when you look at how the Southwest natives dealt with their dead. They were digging holes and having a hole in the Sipapu, which is sort of the burial chamber, sort of. But anyway, it represents a connection to the energies of the earth. And there's always the number 4 is always introduced into that equation, how they would, there's something called the 4 logs that they would use, and then there was 4 bowls that they would put on the heads of the dead, which have little holes in them. And this had something to do with capturing the spirit of the person, the deceased person, because it takes several days for the spirit to leave. And then that would be, they would place them in these domed or differently shaped structures, but part of it would be underground. And it's kind of another form of I think the mound sort of technology that you saw in the East, where they were burying bodies in these mounds. And the question of who built them is kind of rendered less important when you realize that what they were doing was, I think, infusing the mounds with the spirits of the dead. And I think that's why we see so many paranormal sightings and things around the mounds. And then also I found out that they were doing it with trees. They were hollowing out trees and burying the bones of the deceased in trees, and that was more in the Northwest here. They were doing that, but they did it in caves as well. So you have these places where people were buried, infusing those places with the spirit energy, and also it explains the hybridness of some of the creatures, that you have human creature hybrids, because they were also, in certain cases, burying bones, animal bones, in these places. And if there's some weird way that can form a human-animal hybrid spirit energy, then that would explain why we see those.
Also, before we, Robert, if you want to address that, by all means.
Yeah.
But Robert, you don't have a website really that anybody.
No.
All right. Are you?
No.
Are you thinking about putting one up, or is this not going to happen?
Probably not going to happen. Okay. I have to retain my legitimacy somehow as a research scientist.
That's why they make pseudonyms.
That's what I should. That's right. There you go. That's probably what I should do. But what Andy was just saying is something that's really intrigued me for years and years, decades probably, is this idea of what is it that's so special about bones? And we've got cultures that literally the bones of the dead were almost revered were given as much reverence, if not more reverence, than practically the living. And a good example is the Huron. The Huron maintained enormous ossuaries where they would actually carry the bones with them, and if they moved their villages or anything, and they would then rebuild the ossuary and put the bones back in there. And these bones apparently were thought to have some kind of a spiritual or mystical potency, and the dead would move in and out of this, and this was the only way to keep the spirits of the ancestors appeased. And we see this. One of the interesting things to me, and it's just Andy and I kind of emailed back and forth about, and I don't want to completely go into a bunch of a discussion on military installations right now, but we talked about how, certain military installations are located within a certain specific geology, because that a good example is there's there's a site in Pendleton County, West Virginia, where it's really the equivalent of what used to be the old Signal Corps Center for the Navy, but now they don't use flags anymore to send signals. They do it with radio telemetry and things like that. But they buried this facility in a shale, and shale has a unique quality in that it's really made up of clay that's been hardened over the millennia and into a rock. And of course, if you take that one step further, you get the mineral mica. But I'm getting ahead of myself. But the important thing is this stuff is veritably impenetrable to microwaves. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out, so to speak. You can't.
Robert, let me ask you real quick right there. Just hang on to what you got. Just got to ask you. Is shale, I always equate that, being a boy that hung around a lot in the Appalachians, especially in the Catskills and Greens. Is shale something that has something to do with bluestone and or?
No.
Okay. What about
bluestone is that's a little bit different. We can talk about a little bit more about that later.
All right. Here's the second thing then. Is shale something that is endemic just to the Northeast?
No, not at all.
All right. Thank you.
Not at all.
Okay.
But the key is this. Right in its molecular structure, it contains water. All right, right, and not just. This is not water. When we think of like they squeezed it, you could squeeze water out of it. This is water that's right in the structure of the molecule. And water, of course, will absorb microwave radiation. So this stuff you can't, like I said, you can't see through it if you're going to use anything that's in that range of the electromagnetic spectrum, and you can't see out, which makes a great secure facility, if you will. Now, here's where, to me, it gets weird. If we look at the Adena burials, one of the things that's most intriguing about these burials is the grave itself, the actual chamber where the bones are reposing, are very often lined with the mineral mica. Now, mica has the same property. It's a wonderful insulator. In fact, they mined it extensively back in the 1960s in North Carolina because they needed it to essentially act as an insulating material for radiation work. And work with when they were going, hell bent for leather with the nuclear bomb research. But the question is, why the heck were they importing this exotic mineral? The closest place they could get it would be, the Native Americans would be able to get it, would have been North Carolina. And these sheets of mica line these graves. Now, were they keeping something in? Were they allowing something to go back in there and not dissipate? You know what I mean?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
There's any number of pretty minerals that you could line a grave with, but why this one? And why something that's so exotic and so strange that would be the mineral you would choose? And this jumps over to, for instance, the Great Pyramid, the main burial chamber, the actual sepulcher where the remnants of the sarcophagus that's in there. That's the only chamber in the pyramid that's lined with granite. Well, one of the characteristics of granite it usually contains in its structure, granite's a mixed mineral. It contains quartz and feldspar and mica.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Wow. So it's one of these things where it's like, what? When you get the feeling sometimes, and Andrew, I don't know, did you get a chance to go up to Chaco Canyon at all when you were in New Mexico?
I've been out there long time ago.
To Chaco?
Yeah.
Because one of the things with Chaco that's very strange is when you go to the site, there's these rooms that had no windows. They had one door and it was sealed. And the question that you end up asking yourself is, was this a room that somebody was living in? You almost get the feeling that they were trying to keep something in.
Yeah, I was just at Bandelier which has some of those and kind of buildings. And we were thinking the same thing. These don't look like places that anyone could live in where they need storage. Why would they need all that storage?
Right. See, and it all falls flat. The explanations just sort of fall flat. You know what I mean? It's kind of, it's when I was working out in Springerville, Arizona, and this is in the culture that we moderns have named them. We call them the Mugione people. They're actually the ancestors of the Zuni. Their pueblos are still dot that area, and there's many of them. And the one that I was most familiar with is in Springerville. It's called Casa Malpais. And I actually got the chance. No, they don't ordinarily let people into this area, but I knew the archaeologist who ran the site, and he let me go down into there was what they call the catacombs, which was behind the main mesa, or the main pueblo. It's down in this lava rock, and I asked the archaeologist there, my friend, before this, because apparently the whole thing was ransacked. And I said, before this was ransacked, how many people were interred here, do you think? And he goes, at least several hundred. And I'll never forget, I had the most uncanny feeling as I descended the ladder into this thing, that it was kind of this overwhelming, it was almost like something where you didn't hear the words, but it was spoken into my heart and mind, where it basically said, okay, buddy, look around, but don't spend too much time here and get the F out. Okay. And that's literally what it was like. It was like, yeah, we know you're not, you're not here as a hostile, but, you're not meant to be here either. And this is a place of the dead. And so get out.
Let me hold you right there if I could, Robert. Andrew, what he's talking about, have you had that same feeling?
Yeah, and I got it when I was at Bandelier. This is a place near Los Alamos, oddly enough, and they had the Sipapoo. Around it, they have crescent moon-shaped units that have all of these little rooms that look like who knows what, for what reason, no one, it doesn't look like it looks like a spiritual place. It doesn't look like a living space. From above, you look down on it and you see that crescent shape, which we've talked about before. It's a Moor symbol, but not to get into the Moors or anything, but I started to realize, and by the way, there's a bird's rock there. There's a rock that looks like, to me, a Garuda sitting there in a meditation pose. It's a formation. And I looked down, and it all started to get real strange. And I was like, wow, this is maybe some kind of Birdman thing. And then, but the interesting thing here is that when I got back, I started thinking about that, and I started thinking of that shape. And that's one of the shapes that's implied in this Serpent Mound crop circle that occurred in 2004, which for some reason seemed to draw us to it, to see it. And if you look at that thing, I'm convinced that there's some symbolism here that's really important. And it's obvious, some of it's obvious. You've got the Vesica Pisces. I'm sorry. It looks like an eyeball, basically. And so this crop circle has the eyeball shape, and I was doing a drawing of the mound. We were talking about the mounds in Albuquerque. I was talking with some witnesses there that I've interviewed before. And we started to realize, well, if there's an underground part to the mound, the Sipapoo, and then there's a dome shape on top, how would you draw that? And when you draw it, it looks like this crop circle. And, because it's implied, like if you do architectural drawings or anything, you have these lines that go behind that are usually dotted or whatever. And when you do that with that mound, you start to see something like this crop circle. And there are also 4 orbs on the crop circle floating at sort of representing the 4 directions. And then there's also an extra dome on top, and I'm not sure what that's all about, but anyway, these symbolisms are like right there, and it's just that we're not quite interpreting them correctly, I think.
Robert, you
No, I agree. It's and the thing is once you key into these, we use a term, and I guess people use it in a lot of different fields, but in geology, paleontology, we call it a search image. And once you develop a search image, you start seeing this stuff. I always, after reading some of the things Andy's written and being somewhat familiar with his work, it's apparent to me that he is drawn, interestingly enough, to sites that for lack of a better term, the winged entity is associated closely with. I tend to be drawn to sites where the serpent energy is drawn to. It seems that no matter what archaeological site I go to, if there's petroglyphs there's like serpents all over the place.
Okay.
That's what are these things haunting me or something? It's like I can't seem to escape them. And it's very interesting because in the old Taoist mythology, that's the two polarities: the phoenix and the serpent, the phoenix and the dragon, the eagle and the dragon.
And I think you can access the mystery, whatever that is, from either side.
Yep, you sure can. And that's probably why I spend so much. I mean, I've been a caver since I was in my early teen years, and it's something that I love to do, and I love going underground. It's and that's obviously connected with, that's where the serpent resides. The great python that was defeated by Apollo in whatchamacallit, at Delphi. It dwelled underground, and then he banished it to the underground. So it's that was and again in the Taoist system, you have these two forces, these two telluric forces, that one that runs along the ridge tops, and that's associated again with the flying entities versus the force that runs under the earth. And it's usually associated with underground rivers and streams, and that's the serpent force. And where the two come together, where you have a cave beneath a ridge that has a river running through it, that's where the potency is considered to be the greatest. That's the places that sizzle and pop, so to speak.
Well, I'd like to hear more about. I remember you mentioned something about finding some dinosaur bones and things.
Yeah,
that's really interesting. I don't know.
Well, and see, this is the bone finding thing is again where it brings us back to this. What kind of potency is there in these bones, whether they're 100 years old or 78 million years old? And just best example I can give, we found I've been lucky enough to actually discover two new paleontological sites. One in New Jersey, and it was the first one actually found in first new site discovered in New Jersey in probably over a century. Really.
Where was that, by the way?
It's outside of a little town called Ellisdale, and we kind of try to keep the exact location secret.
Can we say it's in the south of the state?
It's in southern New Jersey.
Okay.
We're south central New Jersey.
Okay.
It's almost right where Burlington, Monmouth County, and Mercer counties come together.
Okay, thank you.
About 12 miles southeast of Trenton. And that was I discovered that with a friend of mine, Bob O'Neill, back in 1980. But and it was, we were looking for kind of a new site. I had moved back to New Jersey after being gone for many years, and was interested. I was trained formally in paleontology and was interested in finding something. But I knew where a lot of other people had been finding material, and really we went there and just found the same things they had been finding. So I kind of wanted to find someplace new. And we started looking at maps and seeing where there would be some potential to find some new localities. And I knew not too far from where I lived, I was living in the little town of Allentown, New Jersey, it's not Allentown, Pennsylvania for the listeners, it's Allentown, New Jersey. And not too far, I mean, it was only a few miles away, was a place where the Crosswicks Creek had intercepted some beds that had some potential, although really very little had ever been found in them before. And we went and looked in this one ravine Didn't find much of anything, really. It didn't look like it held much promise. And we did that early in the year. It was probably in the late spring. And every time I would drive past this ravine, and it got awful. It got to the point of where I almost felt like when I would drive by it that there was, something pulling me, drawing me, forcing me, saying, stop the vehicle and get out and look. And it got to the point where literally I said to Bob in late summer, early autumn of 1980, we've got to go back to that ravine again and look, because if I don't, I'm going to go insane. I'm going to go crazy. That's how bad it's gotten. And he was like, all right, let's go look. And so we did. And we couldn't have walked more than, 10 yards, and bent down, and, my eyes went wide. I mean, here's a chunk of bone, portion of a neck vertebra from a duck-billed dinosaur just laying there in the stream bed. Walked a few more feet. There was a chunk of turtle bone from a turtle shell that was probably the size of a kitchen table, and was the piece of bone was just big enough to cover the palm of my hand. I walked a few more feet and found something else. Well, we gathered all this stuff up, brought it in to a friend of mine who's the curator still the curator at the Science Bureau at the New Jersey State Museum in Trenton. And he just smiled and he looked at me and said, "Boy, this is nice stuff, Bob. But, how long did it take you to get this?" And I was like, "Dave, it didn't. I got it all in one day." And he looked at me. He was like, "What?" I said, "We got it all in one day. So you better keep your eye on this place." And so it got to the point though where we would go after every heavy rainfall to look for bones that had gotten washed out and stuff. And what we started to become aware of was that we knew there were bones there. This was Bob and I, before we even had seen them. I mean, there was I don't know how else to describe it, a heaviness in the air. As soon as you started to feel that this almost preternatural heaviness, this different feeling. It was I can't put it into words properly. But it's like it's suddenly everything kind of slows down and you literally feel like it was almost like you become heavier. And when I got that feeling, I would just stop and slow down, drop down, literally into a squatting position and look very closely at the ground. And almost without fail, in that little stretch of the stream bed, I would find something. And I always remember my favorite incident was when the big vertebrate paleontology meetings were being held in Philadelphia in the mid-1980s, and our site was part of one of the field trip stops. And there was all these very, well-heeled and well-respected, paleontologists visiting the site, and they were all wandering around. And one of the people who was with us said, "Well, we hope maybe somebody can find something." And I'll never forget, because Bob walked up the middle of the stream bed, and all of a sudden I see him stop, and I knew exactly what was going on because it's kind of, you get this sort of almost like this, it's like a hand grabs you and stops you. And he suddenly bent down and said, "There are bones here." And he plunged his hands. It wasn't even the bones laying on the surface. He plunged his hands through the sediment and starts pulling bone up out of the sediment in the bottom of the stream bed. We're all standing there with our mouths open. And I mean, it wasn't like any of this stuff was. I mean, it was. I know Bob. This guy is absolutely honest as the day is long. It's not like he could have gone in there and planted this stuff. But he literally went right to it and started pulling it out. And it was like, what the heck? I mean, we were all just literally agog. And I less so than anybody else because I knew what he was doing. But it's that kind of stuff you see where, I'll talk about this freely in this venue, but I, when I go to give a paper from the podium at the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology meetings, I can't really.
No, you can't do that.
Talk too much about it because then everybody's like, oh, well, whatever. But, the funny thing is, in paleontology, this is nothing new. There's been, we've known, and when I say we, meaning the paleological, geological community, this mode of inquiry, and whatever you want to call it, whether it's intuitive, tuning into earth energies, whatever it may be, this has been around, and people have done this for a long, long time. And I mean, it's been documented. That's the thing. Charles Sternberg, who was the fame, I don't know if you've ever heard of Cope and Marsh. And you're familiar with those names at all? No. All right, Cope and Marsh, these were the two famous paleontologists that were involved in the so-called dinosaur wars back in the late 19th century. They were tremendous rivals. Sternberg was Cope's preparator, his main field assistant. And Sternberg, the first significant specimen that he found was found in the chalk out in Kansas. Well, the footnote to that story is that he dreamed about it several nights before he actually went out and found it. And not only did he dream about it, but he dreamed correctly what it was. And again, Sternberg was one of these guys this was a very practical, very this was not a man who was given to flights of fancy. He was a very staid Hansen, if you know what I mean.
Sure.
And so this is Sternberg said it happened that way. It's doubtless that it did. And he used to say that Cope himself, Dr. Cope, would he would wake Sternberg up in the camp because he would have these horrible nightmares, horrible nightmares. And when Sternberg asked him what was the nature of these nightmares, because Cope would just wake up sometimes screaming, sweating. It was awful. And he said that I can see the extinct creatures, and they're tossing me in the air like a ball and batting me about. And these nightmares would increase in severity when they were out in the fossil beds. That was he did not have them when he was back in Philadelphia.
Right.
But when he was out there amidst the bones was when it was the worst. And Sternberg said it was frightening. I mean, it was a frightening thing to see, but it was Cope was just it was just an awful thing, these horrible nightmares.
Let me ask you, we're at 6 minutes after the hour, but did Cope, I mean, was he taking these dreams as necessarily warnings not to go any further, or just the fact that he was immersed so much in this history that it poured over into his dream state?
I think that may be, I mean, that's probably the most reasonable explanation. Is that he was so caught up in the work. I mean, and whenever you're doing intense work, you can tend to dream about it, stuff like that. But it was just the nature of the dreams. It's what's so strange. I mean, you can dream about bones. That's one thing. But to dream that the skeletons are animated, and are kicking you around and gamboling with you. I mean, it's like, that's where it starts to then go into a whole different realm. And, the thing with Cope that many people found so well, his admirers found it a wonderful trait. His detractors, it made them crazy, was Cope had this uncanny ability to, all you had to give him was one bone, one or two bones from a skeleton, and he literally would be able to see, in his sixth sense, whatever you want to call it, what the whole animal looked like, what the whole skeleton looked like.
Jeez.
And more often than not, he was right.
You know what that reminds me of, though? I mean, we look at this with regard to human crime and stuff. I mean, he was like a profiler.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he could take this and know what,
Yep.
All right, let me just stop there for a second so we can kind of gas up and such.
Uh-huh.
We're talking right now with Robert Denton Jr. and also Andrew Colvin about some of their mutual experiences that have to do with, let's face it, things that are above and below the earth. And I'd like to go into that a little bit more when we come back. We'll see you after the break. All right, we took a little break for a number of purposes, but we're back, and that doesn't really mean much to you folks with regard to the time. But we did want to more or less compare some notes and see where we would like to go with the remainder of this interview. I asked kind of, if I could, to go back and ask a couple of questions with some of the topics that were raised that I think are extremely interesting. I mean, just things that pop out, to me. I would hope the listeners feel the same way. But, with what you said, especially, Robert, and we'll start with you, and Andy, I'll throw it to you also. Very interesting that you would say, Robert, that you were involved, I guess you could call it, with the subterranean world, and in symbolism, the serpentine world. Uh-huh. Andrew, on the other hand, though, he's not a stranger to that, because if he's involved with the Garuda legend and the Mothman, is something that's above. And of course, you know what I'm thinking about too, with the famous painting of as it is above, it is down below, or whatever.
Yep.
Is that any kind of coincidence? And is there also? I want to add this also. Do we have any kind of legend, historic, mythic, call it what you will, or all of them? This connection between the serpent, the aviary, if you will, the bird, and also with perhaps in the middle, the dinosaur. I mean, really, they're all related, aren't they? And Robert, I'll just throw that to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, the most obvious connection is, right straight out of Mesoamerican mythology is the feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl. Here you have which is essentially the Western Hemisphere's version of the dragon. And, the dragon of Chinese mythology. This is the creature that embodies, it's the unification of those two principles.
All right, let me ask you this. There seems to be some people who believe there's connectivity between, and maybe it's the same, between the dinosaur and the dragon. Mm-hmm. What about that?
Well,
yeah.
See, I don't know. I'm weird when it comes to the whole, I don't know what to call it, the cryptozoology thing.
Right, okay.
I guess. I feel, and I've always felt, this is just my humble opinion, that these beings, these manifestations, whatever they may be, whether it's dragons, Garudas, Mothman, the Jersey Devil, whatever, that they are a manifestation of ourselves, that our consciousness is bringing these things into being. That does not mean they're not real, but they are in reality, but the reality of our consciousness, our perception, and it's powerful enough that it's not just you see it. There's a consensus. You know what I mean?
Okay.
And so I always felt that if you're going to go hunting for the Jersey Devil and you want to take footprint tracks and things like that and try to explain this away as some living, breathing being, you're going to be hunting for the rest of your life and maybe many lifetimes to come, because that's not where you're going to find this critter hiding. And as far as connection with dinosaurs, we find that in an awful lot of places, people who have lived in places where large numbers of dinosaur fossils have been found, they have legends that involve dragons or serpents or great beasts or whatever you call it. And here's a good example. Of course, the western interior of the United States, or of North America, the Native American people have many legends involving great creatures. They thought that the dinosaur bones were the remnants of wars that took place in ancient times between a race of giant humans and giant animals, and they couldn't coexist. And they had to have a great battle. They had to have great battles. And we discovered the second site that I was one of the discoverers of in the Zuni Basin. The Zuni themselves have legends that say that there was a great battle just south of the Zuni Salt Lake. And lo and behold, where did we find the site? It's just south of the Zuni Salt Lake, literally right smack on top of where the Zuni people themselves say this battle took place. In another place where some of the most wonderful paleontological discoveries have been made in Europe is of all things in the Carpathian Alps in Romania. What was the original name of Dracula? Dragul, the dragon.
Right.
Coincidence? I think not. So.
Yeah, wasn't the dragon even like some? I'm not saying it was a coat of his arms.
Oh, it was.
It was. Okay, that's okay.
And Arthur's father as well.
Okay.
These dragons keep popping up in all these places, and it's kind of, there seems to be always a connection of some kind wherever these dragon legends, or where people adopt the dragon as a heraldic motif, or whatever you want to call it. If you look hard enough, there seems to be some dinosaur connection in these places, and I don't think it's a coincidence. I just don't.
Let me throw that to you, Andrew, too. What about this mystic connection, or otherwise, it could be a very physical connection between serpents and flying things, and wherever they might meet in the middle?
Well, they, most of my stuff's been in the Garuda realm, and that's it. That's the key thing that the Garuda's always doing. He's always clutching a serpent, and I've always interpreted, well, I haven't always, but more recently interpreted that as an allusion to what is happening above the earth being a reflection or an emanation from something inside the earth.
That's right, exactly. And I think, can we? I don't know. It would seem to me that if you had to attach a good or a bad connotation to either creature, of course, serpents have like no chance of being looked at as being positive. And I would
not in our culture.
No, not in our culture, exactly. And of course, birds also would be positive. And like he just said, what is the conqueror of the serpent in the symbology nationalistically of Mexico and this country, and somewhat, I guess, even in Scripture, and that is the bird's talons, obviously having within its clutch a serpent.
Andy, you want to go, or? I wanted you to comment on that theory that I've heard proposed here and there, that bones are not necessarily something that lived, but maybe is the Earth creating new species below ground that somehow become animated above ground. Then to Viz, I wanted to throw this out for next time that he goes about. Did he hear about this recent? Darwin. It was Darwin's 200th birthday or something. Yes.
200 from when he was born, I guess, and
same day as Abraham Lincoln's birthday.
Yeah, and the Vatican claimed last week that Darwin's theories were first proposed by a priest.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
I thought Viz would like that because it gets into the
I got to check that out because that
Jesuit stuff.
Okay.
I mean, it wasn't a big announcement just about that. It was something buried in the story about the Vatican. I don't know. I can't even. It was a radio, sort of quick radio.
Right.
Okay.
Well, and they see, the thing that's intriguing too is that here's this same Vatican that basically threatened Teilhard de Chardin with excommunication unless he backed off of his theories, and he felt that there was no conflict between evolution and Christianity, that the awakening of consciousness in mankind was the alpha moment, and that the omega moment was when mankind would realize his unison with the Creator. And the church this was complete blasphemy. Yet they wouldn't excommunicate him. They said, "Bad Jesuit."
Hey,
now back off, Teilhard. And all of a sudden now they're coming out with this latest revelation and being very upfront about the fact that the Catholic Church embraces the idea of evolution. And it's a real head scratcher, but then again, is it?
All right, let me just interject if I could that with regard to those individuals or those organizations we're talking about, I think you will find for public consumption a slap on the hand, and you will find behind the scenes a pat on the back.
Yep.
But let me continue because I don't want to lose it. That's a gem that Andy brought up, and that is, what about the Earth creating bones as if it is creating something from beneath?
Yeah, well, see,
off the record.
Off the record, there we go. I have always felt that it's kind of the other way. The other way around. If you look at theosophical literature, Rosicrucian literature, things like that, there is a idea that each life wave skips. That you have the mineral kingdom, the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, and we somehow are supposed to be tied into. We are supposed to help accelerate the evolution of the mineral kingdom. Now, the only thing that's mineral in us, literally, is our bones and our teeth. Okay. So and when these bones are reposing in the ground, they're within their element. It's dust back to dust. But there's still a matrix of life perhaps left there. And what I think, it's hard to. I can envision this in my heart of hearts, but I can't express it with words. Somehow, I believe that does influence evolution, if you will, and it's. I've often wondered if in some of this Rosicrucian or theosophical literature that if what people were thinking about may even been just simply the fact that we're building machines that are based in the mineral kingdom. I mean, what are computers? They're based around silica, and what if they suddenly become self-conscious? This is. Lo and behold, we've just accelerated at least the consciousness level of something that's based in the mineral kingdom. Lo and behold, but
that's kind of what was implied by Jim Moseley hoaxing the kicking off the Wanakee, New Jersey reservoir sightings by a hoax. It creates an impression. It creates an energy form of sorts in other consciousnesses and can apparently created real sightings. And maybe with the Earth there's a two-directional thing going on where people do die and their bones go into the Earth, but maybe the Earth can also reverse that somehow.
Well, I think, exactly. And that's, Bob and I have an expression, and it's kind of we just kid about it all the time, but many a time when people go to the sites that we've worked on, they never find a thing. And yet when we go out there, we find stuff all over the place. And we always say that before we get there, the site knows we're coming. And the bones auger up out of the ground and just sort of pop up. And there they are laying there waiting for us. And it's, but that's kind of along these same lines, is that it's almost, we tease and kid about this, but, at the same time, there's almost like a sly little wink there that, it may not be happening exactly that way, but something strange is going on.
Well, it's interesting, and just to bring up a little Mon word tidbit, the word manana, M-A-N-A-N-A, and I believe that's Southeast Asia, if I'm not wrong, means reflection. And I started thinking of that dome shape and how the dome shape, is such a great shape for keeping things out. Things that might fall, they deflect in all directions, and they also reflect inward. And would be perfect reservoirs for any kind of energy. And by the way, I think it's Southeast Asia. Let me look. Anyway, Ropen. I was looking up the Ropen. First I was looking at Kongamatu, which has a Kong name, which kind of reminds me of King Kong and Bigfoot, but that's a flying pterosaur in Africa. And then there's another one called the Ropen.
Right.
And the Ropen is synonymous with Indava, some people think. Indava is another flying being that, and both of these are thought to be bioluminescent.
Oh, wow.
And so they're called the Indava lights. And
there we go. Yep.
And this kind of gets back to Indrid Cold, because I've always thought that there was an Indra connection to his name, meaning he was a cooled down Indritic being with Earth, and sort of in this,
rather than the fiery Indra of the Hindu god of fire.
Yeah, and Indaba is in New Guinea, which is where you have just a tremendous series of bird cultures. People worshiping their existences are totally wrapped up in birds.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. It's I lost my train of thought. Oh, you had mentioned the reflecting things in, and that reminded me again. One of the things, I always found this kind of intriguing. One of the things that the Zuni were very, very strict about, and they really, they really felt this was critical, was when they had found several chambers at this Casa Malpais site I was telling you about that had never been opened, and the Zuni were insistent that if they were to open these things, that number one, no human was to be allowed to go down into these sealed chambers. They could open a small hole. They could put a camera down to look at the grave goods and things like that, but no one was to go in. No one was to open it up for any great length of time, and it was to be sealed as quickly as possible once they got to peek down in there. And this was absolute. This was an absolute thing. And I always thought, again, this was very interesting. It's, is this simply respecting the dead, or does it sound like they're trying to keep something in, or keep something where it belongs, if you will?
Well, since you're talking about the Zunis, that reminds me, I just recently got an email from a guy on the Navajo res who says that his grandmother saw the Thunderbird, and that it was this enormous, hugely enormous bird which burned the tops of the trees as it flew over. And so here we have another, sort of reference to these manifestations having light or energy coming off of them that's really physically can affect things. So it's more than just an hallucination. It's a, it's a co-creation.
I don't see. Boy, hallucination isn't. That's not. I didn't want to give an impression that it's hallucination.
Oh, I didn't say you did. I just know that a lot of people think about it that way, and so I always try to refer to that.
Right.
For those who are still thinking of it that way.
Yeah, these manifestations, whatever you want to call them, projections. They have a physical power in this dualism that we exist in. You know what I mean? That's not to say they don't. They say they do. But again, to look at them in a very mundane way, from the again, I don't want to hack too hard on the cryptozoology gang, but I keep feeling that they want to grab one of these things and run a DNA test on it, and that's not, you're not going to be able to do that.
What they've been doing of late was there's a guy who wrote a book about Thunderbirds recently, and I've mentioned this before, that early on I found that they had a list of animals that they wanted to spin in their direction. That was 2 or 3 years ago. So and you're starting to see how it's playing out, and you have people writing more and more about the big bird, quote, big bird from Texas or wherever, or the Thunderbird, and they'll focus on that part of it. And then this guy threw in Mothman into his book, and then someone on Amazon was saying, well, there's no, Mothman doesn't look like a pterosaur, so why would you be throwing Mothman in with that? Right. And they want to, get Mothman into the big bird camp and write it off as a pterosaur. But the problem is that, as he admitted in a recent interview, Big Bird, the name Big Bird is a media creation, just as the name Mothman is a media creation. And yet, with regard to Mothman, some of the other cryptozoologists love to call him the Big Bird.
Yes.
And claiming that that's what he was called at the time, and it wasn't. I can tell you, I was there. He was referred to as a Birdman on the news at night, more than once. It was not.
Yeah, and see, that's the thing. That's the, see, and again, it all comes back to this idea, to me at least, of cultural milieu. I mean, if you are in a culture that says that the powerful, whatever you want to call it, the airborne entity, that which symbolizes air and fire, okay, is this airborne being, and in your culture, that airborne being of the greatest potency is the firebird. That is what you will see, and the firebird will manifest itself. On the other hand, if you're immersed in the culture of, whatever, modern Western popular culture, you might see it as a flying disc that singes the ground. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's I think again, and it all depends on where you are at the time. And there are some places perhaps where the potency of the prior cultures is so great that it infiltrates itself into the current culture, especially when the people are more sensitive to it. And I think people in the Appalachian region are just, again, they're more sensitive to these kind of things. Mm-hmm. It's a good example, and as you were talking about this, actually a couple of the shows you did a little while back on the Civil War, and you mentioned something about the how it I think one of your people you were interviewing was mentioning how people in the South tend to be a little bit more sensitive to nature, a little bit more attuned to their environment, that kind of thing, possibly because of their Native American background. Many people in the South have Native American blood in them, and I've seen this. I've seen, and this again going to my background and my underground experience, I've seen caves in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, that have literally been so trashed, so stripped of all their formations, painted up on the inside, to the point of where it's just, it's almost heartbreaking to see. Yet, and not to say that caves in Virginia and West Virginia haven't been vandalized, they have, but nowhere near to the same degree. And you don't see all the graffiti all over the place and stuff like that. And I remember asking a couple friends of mine when we were a lot younger, because I have family in Virginia, and that's my connection here. And just kind of in passing, I said, well, how come, you don't see everything trashed up? You don't see everything, all this graffiti and vandalism and stuff like that. And my one friend almost looked aghast, and he was like, oh, man, I wouldn't want to do anything like that. And I said, why? And what he said was not that it's against the law, not that it's wrong. He said, oh, I don't know, it's just something bad might happen to you. Meaning that somehow this desecration of the environment could bring ill luck to you.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, metaphysical paybacks.
Yep. And this was coming from a 17-year-old kid in West Virginia.
Let's face something too, and this is not an excuse whatsoever. And I think of what Mac was talking about, McDonald King Aston. Mm-hmm. There was something obviously that took place in the Northeast. It lent itself to industrialization, the Yankee entrepreneurial spirit, which was, of course, lampooned by Ichabod Crane.
Yep.
There was something very not likable about it. And, of course, as I had mentioned to Mac about Dr. Daniel Paul, a full-blooded Micmac who wrote that book, We Were Not the Savages, saying there was something curious about the Brits. And, of course, we are the extensions of them. But, you take a look in the Northeast, and obviously you have the greatest amount of metropolitan centers, and it certainly does remove you from the bounties and the wonder of, and I don't mean to go on and be saccharine about this, of nature.
Yeah. Oh, no, I agree. And it's to people who are raised in the urban, suburban environment exclusively, nature is scary. I had friends who lived in Staten Island, and when they would come to visit us in South Jersey, they would literally, it was scary to them. Those woods out there were scary. They used to say to us, well, you guys you didn't have to put your shoes on and put your shotguns away just for us.
Okay.
And I never realized that just as scared as I would be walking by myself in an urban environment, I go out in the woods by myself, and I have it never would occur to me that I would be in any kind of danger, either real or preternatural. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Whereas these guys they were literally, these guys and gals they're terrified. I mean, this is because it's there's things out there. God knows what, but,
Sure.
But.
Well, I had the great good fortune to be exiled out of urban northeast Jersey to spend my grammar school summers up in the Hudson Valley.
Mm-hmm.
And so something stayed with me with that and has continued to. But what I wanted to, and also, I mean, let's face it. I mean, in the South too, it lent itself more to agrarian pursuits, and here we now have a dichotomy between the two sections, the two regions, which of course were exacerbated, which didn't have to be, but that's part of having a war,
Oh yeah.
But I want to mention something to you guys, and we'll dovetail. Well, two things real quick. I just want to make mention because this caught me, and Andy, you brought this up about bones being planted in trees, in the hollows of trees. Is that right?
Right.
What struck me was, of course, this is almost kind of a reversal in a sense, and I don't know where this is going, but I want to throw it out because I think there's something to it. I think about the story about Hiram Abiff, who, upon his death, I believe, swallowed an acacia pit.
Yes.
So that when he was buried, something from him would spring, and that would be an acacia tree. That something good would happen because of his death, something would come back to nature. Is there anything in the reversal where there might be, especially in native peoples' cultures, where if you take the bones of a human, or maybe even of an animal, and place them inside a tree, that tree may take on, in a reversal situation here, some kind of personification of the individual? There might be some kind of human magic there.
That's absolutely what they think. And there's a direct quote that I have that's going to be in the Mothman's 4 book that I'm doing. But they would they would put bones inside, and then they would peel the bark back. The big bones would go inside, and then the little bones would go under the bark, and then they would push the bark back up and get it to grow again. So the bones would literally soak into the tree.
So, Andy, let me ask you this, and I'll throw it to Robert. In your estimation or your research or opinion, whatever, are you seeing some kind of eternity that is being forged by the flora and humans? Andy?
What was that? Flora? Plants?
Oh, all right. No, I thought we dropped a signal. That was a pregnant pause. Some kind of combination between nature.
If you were mentioning flora, I'll just say that's my favorite thing I like to say to vegans, hardcore vegans, is, plants are alive just like animals.
Oh, there you go. All right. Well, let me ask you this, though. Do you find something traditionally, whatever, that tries to amalgamate nature, let's say, and the human psyche? Why do they plant bones in the trees, Andy?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. Why do they? I think some of it may be coming. I mean, they do. On the surface, they're saying, yes, we will live on in these trees. But maybe at a deeper level, it's about preserving the brilliance of their approach to life. I mean, they lived a sustainable lifestyle. You couldn't. I just heard this on the radio today. In most native cultures, having children, multiple children in a row, was considered nuts. Like to have a kid, you were supposed to wait 7 years generally to have a second child if you were going to do that. And they just were appalled at the Europeans. Everything about the Europeans. But I think it's about. If you consider that they were possibly creating hybrid beings as well, now they must know at some level that they're carrying on a deeper tradition, deep in consciousness, and that it's going to continue to work, and people will continue to see it. And as most of the interviews I've done show, creative people or people become creative by seeing these things that are totally outside the prison mind trap of a materialistic commercial capitalist society. So it literally keeps alive in a real way these older traditions, and respect for nature and respect for ourselves, and it needs to be preserved, and that's one way to do it.
Robert, also, I mean, you aren't, I'm sure, a stranger to the Biff story, but that may also reflect what people felt at a certain time. I don't think it's completely fictional. But having said that, what about this supposed, you can almost call it an ingrafting of the human with nature? That's
an interesting thing, because it's actually the first I've heard of that tradition. And it's got my wheels are going here. I'm about a mile a minute thinking about it.
Okay.
Because especially if you're placing the bones in a living tree, number one, what is that? I mean, it's what do we give our plants when we want them to grow really well? Bone meal.
That's right.
They'll obviously the plants will absorb this stuff readily and incorporate it into their structure.
Yep.
Now, if the bones have this potency, if there's a memory, a matrix involved in that
structure
mineral,
yeah,
and these living things are incorporating into their structure, the results are probably pretty interesting, to say the least.
Especially if the bones had been jacked up on occultum, because they had this supposed process of, and I can't remember the exact way they did it now, but there was, I guess, once somebody had reached enlightenment, the bones changed, and that whatever was in the bones of that person could be re-ingested and carried on through multiple generations.
Right. So we see a lot. I mean, there's a lot of cultures around the world that the act of and this is not, we're not talking about cannibalism for sustenance. We're talking about ritual cannibalism, and in many cases it involves the bones. And then I don't think there's any coincidence with that.
Also, that term you guys were using, ingrafters, I just read that, I think last night in an article about reincarnation. That's a word that was used in the old days for spirits that reassign you. They're like ultra-terrestrials who will, in the reincarnation process, get in there and more or less in a trickster sort of fashion, get people to reincarnate in certain bodies or certain places and in certain ways.
Yep.
But referring back to something I was saying earlier about the cryptozoologist, that same guy, when they are faced with dealing with the hybrid issue of hybrid beings, they're basically trying to search for an explanation for why they look different. This particular guy said, well, yeah, it could be that the first option for these creatures, he said, was they're either thunderbirds or condor-like birds, or they're pterosaurs, and then somehow he had to explain other ones. Said, well, but they could be giant bats, which was one of the cryptolist items, by the way. But a giant bat that could have a. Then he talked about a pterosaur that could have a bat face. So he's admitting that hybrids might be possible in the interview, but yet if you were to ask him, well, what about a human-animal hybrid, then suddenly, that's off limits because then you get into all the ancient symbologies and people's consciousnesses being opened up by the symbolisms in those ancient traditions that would undermine, society at large. It would sort of undermine the kingdom, if you will, if more people knew about this.
Yeah, I agree, and that's that again, this insonderable paradigm of man's the crown of creation. He can't be combined with anything else. Meanwhile, of course, all the Egyptian naders were the gods of the Egyptian pantheon. What do we Anubis has a jackal head. Thoth, you go right down the line. I mean, but that's symbolic of paganism, idolatry.
Well, no, but I mean, could we not admit that this might be a result? I mean, let's face it, of bestiality, and that these mythic creatures actually were the offspring.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
Well, it's either in physical manifestation or spiritual potency, one or the other. You know what I mean?
Right.
I mean, the only question now is like, can you explain it scientifically? Is there a way to describe, this?
Right. Right.
Quantum physics.
And I don't think, and that's the thing. That's where you're going to fall on your face. You know what I mean? It's because this kind of knowing cannot be reached by that mode of inquiry.
No.
Well, I'm just thinking that quantum physics easily can explain it because
absolutely.
If molecules can instantly transmit information, photons can do that.
Yep.
And any kind of information emanating from the body, especially at the traumatic point of death, and being expelled, and then taking also other elements, more subtle elements of the consciousness, take days to leave.
Yep.
Controlling that. And there's obviously information coming off of that person. So I think it's explainable. It's just like, how could you come up with an equation for it?
Right. And that's the thing, and that's why most people a lot of scientists even look at quantum theory as something that's almost inapproachable because of it. It gets dangerously close to mysticism, as does the outer edges of cosmological inquiry. It's scratching the edge.
Well, that's why NASA loves to have these stories. Like the one last week about this satellite collision.
Right.
Which sounds suspicious to me because I researched the companies involved, and I eventually found my way to the Rockefeller AT&T satellite operation.
There you go.
And all that. But this week, it's been, we've just hit the age of Aquarius on the 14th, and I think it just seems like the powers that be are making different moves right now, like with the bank bailout, and
what do you see on the 14th?
The bank losing $179 billion to nowhere, and Cheney getting off, Rove getting off. Obama is apparently not going to go after those guys.
Right.
So they have to have NASA always seems to come up with something space oriented comes up to sort of draw everyone's attention, and also they also had what was that other one?
Are you thinking about the plane crash?
Oh yeah, they had a fossil snake that was longer than a bus that was found.
I saw that.
An old story and a futuristic story and a past story. Sort of getting caught in that loop.
And that's I'll tell you, Andrew, that story was kind of strange because we're how'd you say that discovery wasn't. We've had other giant snake fossils found before. Okay, you know what I mean? But all of a sudden, that was the one that decided to catch the news. That was the one that there was supposedly a press release for. And the question is, how come that day?
Well, that was the day that Obama extended the bailout to 900.
Right.
And the day that Cheney predicted terror, and the day that Pakistan attacked some U.S. trucks.
Yep.
And it was also the day right after, Viz, you'll be interested, you may remember this, Ratzinger asked one of his bishops to recant previous Holocaust denials.
Yep. Yes, that's right.
Yep. Yeah, and see, that's the thing where it's and that was what was so odd to me. As a paleontologist, I'm reading this story and I'm going, is this is newsworthy? And then, like you said, all these other things are happening, and once again, it's sort of, it's time to put out the smoke screen, boys.
Yeah, exactly.
And another thing also, and of course we understand in the old days of newspapers only, and I guess pretty much with radio, and of course even TV before it went 24/7. I mean, think of the Stone Age of TV and radio, but especially in newspapers to this very day, they talk about the 5 to 7 news holes. So they'll just rotate out boogeymen and bad things and whatever. And one of the things that I had a laugh about was about 2 weekends ago. I had said to my wife while we were biking, I'm going, isn't it interesting how Iran isn't a bad guy right now? And of course, bang, Iran's back in so they rotate the stuff out to keep you in a constant state of neurosis, paranoia, whatever. But I'll tell you what, guys, we can move on to one thing, and I just want to throw this out. You guys can address it if you wish. But as we're talking about things subterrestrial and extraterrestrial and otherwise, if you allow me just to interject this, I think that the book of Revelation is greatly overlooked for some of the, shall we say, prepositions that are in there and what we might expect in the future. And this harkens back to what you were all talking about, that there are creatures in the earth. And another thing I would say, that may seem like nothing, but just think about what that says, that there would be the immersion of who knows what from in the earth. And the other thing also, there is something about mountains, we know that, but one of the things I look back at also is that when Satan was tempting Christ, he took him in a mountain.
Yes.
To show him the kingdoms of the world. Now, that may seem trivial. I think people should not dismiss that as just a bad choice of prepositions.
Right.
That there is something most certainly going on, and this is what you guys have been talking about. One, that there is something in the earth, in the mountains, and we have no idea just exactly what might be going on. That is something I think that all of us, when I'm referring to the three of us, have thought about, and perhaps, Robert, that might be something that has come to you too. I don't know. We didn't speak about this.
Oh, yeah.
But I'll throw it over to you, and also to talk about excavations and caves, which both you and Andy have somewhat in common as far as some thoughts.
Well, you're speaking of he took Christ into the mountain,
right?
In the direct translation.
That's right. It's into the mountain.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Because it's if we go back to another mythos, the brother of Zeus, Hades, Pluto, however you want to call him. Not only did he rule over the underworld and guard the Titans, which not allow them to escape and wreak havoc, but he was supposed to be fantastically rich. All the treasures were down there. Pluto had it all, Right. And where does he dwell? In the subterranean world.
Yeah, from which comes what? Gold and silver.
Right. Yep.
And platinum.
This is and this is the kind of thing where it just kind of makes perfect sense, and that's where would I'm not what actually how is the devil or Satan or whatever, what specifically, how is he referred to in that passage? By what name? So I think that's kind of important sometimes.
Well, everything else, as far as I know, is Satan. There's only one mention of Lucifer, and that's in Isaiah.
Okay, that's in Isaiah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay,
that's the only one.
That's interesting in and of itself. And of course, I always like the rebuke that Christ eventually gives him, which is, to me, when he says, "Get thee behind me," of course, meaning that, listen, buddy, I created you too. You have no sway over me.
But I bring this up because of what we've been talking about. Yep. That it is not necessarily a real stretch to wonder what might be going on. And
no, and it's absolutely, and I agree. It's the subterranean world is to quote the old Appalachian song, dark as a dungeon, where they say it's as dark as a dungeon and damp as a tomb, but it'll grow in your blood like an addiction, and it's kind of a strange duality in that sense that those great treasures are down there, whether it's coal or gold or diamonds or whatever it may be, but you have to go down there to get them, and that may be part of that whole thing of making caves a repository for the bones of the dead, because we see this, and it's not. It's certainly in the Native American culture there are burial caves that are well known, and so actually there's two different traditions with that. The one tradition that's more in this area, when I say this area, in the northern Alleghenies or central Appalachians, is the idea of the burial cave as an ossuary, where they would allow the bodies to decompose on the surface, they gather up the bones, and then they bring them into the cave and hide them in a niche or some little spot inside the cave. But there's another tradition, which is
cremation, isn't it?
There's a cremation tradition, but there's also this one that's less well known, and it's kind of similar to the cenote sacrifices down in Mesoamerica, which is where they would literally throw the dead into a pit cave, where they would just kind of throw them in, and they would vanish into the underworld. No one would go down there. These were the vertical pit caves, and you see this down in an area where there are a lot of pit caves, which is like in southwestern Virginia and East Tennessee, and what we in the caving world call the TAG area, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia. And there's a lot of pit caves down there that these frightening, vertical entrances. You look down the things that are scary looking. And the burial caves, there's quite a few of them that actually have been found. Unfortunately, many of them sadly have been desecrated, but there's still quite a few of them that haven't been, and that's a slightly different tradition. But again, it's this idea that that there's something. It's not just simply to bury the dead in the ground, in the soil, but to somehow place them in a cave one way or the other. That this is the direct conduit to that subterranean world, if you will.
Andy?
This thing we're talking about right now, that's sort of like history repeating itself. If as I sort of assume, we have on a grand scale of time these Enlightenment ages and ages where we kind of destroy ourselves for a while, and then are reanimated or we rise again. All the legends talk about us coming out of the earth, and while that's true, I think, on the spiritual level or the quantum physics level, it could also be related to these underground facilities that people. I mean, obviously, there's some kind of a need here on the part of elites to instead of changing the world that's within their power to in a way, to make life so much better. They could if they wanted. They decide instead to build these underground cities. Mm-hmm. And just let everything on top go to hell, and I think the Christ story is sort of symbolic of that, because he's a carpenter. He sort of represents the working class, the people that support civilization and allow the wealthy to have what they have. And so him saying no, I will not enter in, is like saying no. You should realize that we're both the same. I am you.
Yep.
And you should try to fix the problems instead of running away. And I think it just gets played over time and time again throughout history. And that's what's one of the things that the Christ story means. And he's, also associated to so many other things we've talked about that are Birdman-like. And then Viz had mentioned the terror keeping us afraid. And just this week, there's been some press about a new pill that will cure post-traumatic stress disorder if taken at the right time. It cures the fear response, the emotional responses to the event. You'll still remember the tragic event, but you won't feel that anymore. And it's almost like they're preparing millions of people, with terror programming, getting us all into the state, and now they're going to provide us with a solution, which is going to be a tremendously profitable drug.
Uh-huh. Sounds awful like Soma.
I'm sorry? Soma?
Sounds awful like the Aldous Huxley's Soma from Brave New World.
But it's also the same old scheme they run. They'll create the problem, but they also have created the solution, and it'll be there when you get there. And, we're seeing this, like all over the place. Again, Obama is being too much bandied about as being like the originator of all these policies. This guy's put in there so this stuff can get done, and it's happening very quickly. You can see a consolidation of more and more power in the government, and what you just brought out, Andrew. Also, this is all getting readied for something in the future. There's no doubt about it, and I don't think any of us, well, again, the three of us, have any problem with, no matter how we feel spiritually, that there is some kind of juggernaut coming down the trail.
Something's coming, and I've always contended that this last 8 years, and now what we've entered into now, meaning Bush and Obama, Bush/Obama, is the most amazing bad cop, good cop scam
yes.
that's ever been pulled off.
Well, if you had lived in the 40s, you'd probably feel that way between FDR and Hoover, and if you lived in the teens, you'd probably feel that way about Taft and Wilson. The point being is, here we go again.
Yep. And, guys, this is kind of interesting. They're playing, Obama is, in a sense, he is a messiah in a way, and they're sort of playing on that. And it's funny because I did this series of photos in the 80s, which started off in Point Pleasant, where I took a picture of myself rising from the earth with a sphere and sort of a Birdman kind of thing. Didn't go for the wings or anything, but that was the basic idea, was a being coming from the earth with an orb, and that may or may not glow, and that I didn't really know why I was compelled to do this, but I did it, and once I had that character, then I decided, hey, I should go around to all the different monuments in the U.S., and that'll be a way to travel the country and see the country, and it also relates to the Amon word, monuments, and then the meanings behind the monuments all had to do with American government for the most part. And I was also playing off of another artist's book about American monuments. So it had a real historical governmental feel to it. And as time went by, I was trying the orb. I wanted to use an orb that looked like those lawn orbs that people have back there in the Ohio Valley. They're these shiny orbs.
Oh yeah, the glass globes that they put on
these little pedestals on their lawn.
Yeah,
I like that. Yeah.
And we had those when I was a kid, and I was fascinated by them. And I always thought that they had something to do with it. It's like maybe by putting those out, you're signaling the other orbs that fly around, these supposed intelligent orbs. And the orbs often are thought to contain these entities, gurus or birdmen or whatever, who can transmogrify after they're, flying around as an orb.
Oh, interesting orb story for you, real quick here, if you don't mind, Viz.
We knew you had one. We knew you had an orb story.
We were at a burial cave in Berkeley County, West Virginia, and this cave was. It's fairly certain that it was a burial cave. Bones haven't actually been discovered in it, but it's in a stretch along the Potomac River, where there's a series of these caves, and several of which bones have been found in. But we went down inside this cave and we took a bunch of pictures, and then came back out, and a very strange thing happened on the way back out. I was again with my friend Bob, and I was able to get out reasonably easy. It's kind of a climb to get. The entrance is almost like a vertical thing where you kind of have to chimney up and climb out. And Bob could not make it out of the entrance. He literally was almost in a panic. And I'm trying to pull him out at one point. He swore up and down that something was holding on to his ankles and pulling him back into the cave. And remember that what I described to you with Bob, I think Bob in a certain way is more sensitive than I am to these forces. And, when we got home and uploaded the pictures to the computer, the cave itself was filled with these orbs. And, they're all over the place. There's one where it looks like it looks like a snowstorm practically. And I always wrote these things off as dust particles, water vapor or whatever it may be. But what changed my mind to that whole thing was when we looked at this one particular picture, and it was taken outside of the cave entrance, and it was bright daylight, broad daylight. I mean, there's no possibility of there, having an effect from the darkness or whatever it may be. And there, in the entrance of the cave, and I'd be more than happy to send you this picture so you could see it, because it's pretty astounding, is right in the entrance of the cave is two orbs, and it's broad daylight.
That's odd.
Yeah, I know. Made me rethink my whole theory on orbs.
Let me throw this out to you, by the way, also. Nothing for nothing, and I don't know if people know why they're doing it, but it seems to me, just for me going around and sampling a cross-section of American life, that besides the orbs on these, what would have been obelisk-type pedestals, Which, by the way, Andy, when you think of monuments, what shape comes into mind? I think.
Dome?
No, I'd say obelisks. And if you take a look at most of the border markers between the United States, Canada, and and Mexico, you will find they're obelisks. And I will tell you, and I think probably, Robert, I'm going to take a guess. If you've ever crossed state lines, as I did, Jersey into New York around Palisades Interstate Parkway, you will find obelisk markers between boundary markers between the states.
Yep.
But what I was going to also say is this: beyond the orbs, which is kind of curious. What I've also found as trappings on houses, and this has not got anything to do with patriotism, are unusually what I would consider large.
The stars.
Stars. There you go. And there's another one, and those are sunbursts.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, so what's with that? So I asked one of my neighbors who I go, yeah, what's with that? He goes, oh, yeah, you like it. I'm like, yeah, I like it. I'm like, no. But he goes, oh, no, you can get this down at Home Depot. I'm going, okay, great. No, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people don't know it, but it just seems to me it's interesting how we inculcate / assimilate some of these, what I would consider rather, well, you may not want to call them a cult, but mystical symbols.
Well, they are. And I even asked, when I first started seeing the stars go up all over the place, I thought everybody who was putting them up were you got to realize, this being a Redskins fan, I thought they were all Dallas fans.
Oh, I thought they had kids in the military. There you go.
And then, but that theory went out the window pretty fast. And I started asking people about these. Oh, it's just a nice decoration, And it was like, wait a minute, you're putting a big metal star on your house because it's a nice decoration? I mean, it's kind of. I mean, I've even seen the strangest thing I've ever seen. You mentioned the sunbursts.
Yeah.
There's a new type of people down in this area. They love to fly Confederate flags, and they say silly things on them like "she ain't coming down" and stuff like that. But there's a new one that it's a Confederate flag behind the bars. There's a sunburst, and I'm always like, what is that all about?
Yeah. Yep.
It's kind of what it's. I mean, a Confederate flag with a sunburst. It's like talk about two things that seem to be internally contradictory somehow.
Right. Yep.
It's the energy emanating from the orb. Speaking of which, I didn't finish that story.
No.
I'm sorry, Andy.
Yeah, I'm sorry too, Andy.
No problem. When I had to go traveling, I couldn't take a glass orb. So I took the cheapest thing I had, which was a basketball, right? And I tried to hide the fact that it was a basketball in the pictures, the best I could. But people seemed to think there was something interesting about the fact that it was a basketball. And so as it progressed, I let it be a basketball. And then I said, well, what the hell? Since I was wanting the guy to look like a shadow being, right? Because that's what I had seen as a kid. And so I had, again, whatever I could afford, and that was a really dark stocking. And so I said, well, I might as well call myself a terrorist then. So it became a terrorist sort of thing too. And I never could figure out what it all meant really until this weekend when I saw Obama on the All-Star game. He's now made basketball the official
national sport,
so to speak, and it all sort of made me wonder if you look at the elements of my series back then, which I think was totally unconscious in a way, again compelled to do it. The symbolisms there are a messiah, historical, governmental kind of figure who's possibly black, possibly likes basketball, and has some link to terrorism. And it makes me wonder if we're going to see a more active terrorism climate in the country with these smaller bombings. Like we've seen, I think, 3 bank bombings now. Actually, one was a medical doctor in Arkansas or somewhere. But we've had those in recent weeks, and I think that and Tom Hartman sort of brought it around by saying terrorism is going to be the way that they change the laws. I mean, whatever laws they still need to change, they've already changed quite a bit of them.
Yep. Well, and that image that you were describing, because when you were describing the idea of holding a basketball. And what that immediately brought into my mind was the old figure from the late 19th and early 20th centuries in newspaper, political cartoons of the archetypal anarchist, dressed in the black overcoat with the black hat and the round bomb with the fuse coming out of it.
Yeah.
Ah. Yeah.
Boris Badenoff.
Yeah, there you go.
Who gets blown
but
up?
he's always got a round bomb
that
he's getting ready to throw. Remember?
Yep, that's right.
Yeah.
So and that's a very archetypal symbol, I think.
And he's a man in black.
Yep. Yes, he is. He's always in black.
All right, now we have to go ahead and dissect all of the Rocky and Bullwinkle shows. Who gets
Rocky can fly,
Huh?
Rocky can fly.
That's another strange thing. So, listen, we're coming up to the end of the show, but what I want to throw out to you guys, and if you would, only for the purposes of of the time we have left in this interview, let me just preface this, and I'm going to throw it to you guys, and then we're out of Dodge. I'm doing an interview with a person who's not been around the internet very much, or on radio shows, Patriot radio shows, for many years. We had a bit of a exchange, and then nothing for about 5 years, and I contacted the person, and we've done 3 out of 4 interviews that'll be released later and after this one. But we talked a lot because the individual is also a Northeasterner like myself, and Andy too. We have to include you also because, let's face it, we're talking about the Appalachians, and no matter what you call them in your state, whether you call them Blue Ridge or
Allegheny.
Yeah,
I'm sort of a displaced Italian New Yorker in West Virginia,
and that's another reason why we love you.
Yeah, and that's a strange coincidence here, because I mentioned this to Viz in an email that I'm also one of these weird mutts, that half Italian and half American from on the Denton side, from where they came here in like the 1630s.
Yeah, I've got that too. Yeah. Irish, getting back to the Celtic thing.
Mm-hmm.
But
anyway.
what I asked her about, and what I'm asking you guys to address, Andy and I have gone on ad infinitum about some of the peculiarities about being involved in and around under a mountain range. And I asked her as well. Well, I gave her away, but because, and I had mentioned this to you when we took a break, Robert, about some strange stuff in what would be called a ramapose at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that inside mountains, who knows what's there? They're cavernous on one hand also, but nobody really knows, except they seem to lend themselves. And I think whether it's urban legend, and I don't think it's completely urban legend, but there is something going on in there. What I would, just say to you guys, and then I'm out of here, and that is, we talked about the possibility about perhaps a connection subterraneously by tunnels or whatever from perhaps New Hampshire down to West Virginia. Places where there might be installations. We all know that Iron Mountain is one of them, and that's subterranean also, not necessarily under a mountain range, but just on the east side of the Hudson from the Catskills. But that there is some kind of connection going on down there, and it just seems to be something to it. So, Robert, first I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to throw it to Andy. You guys close it any way you want to. But, obviously, you as a geologist, you as somebody who's a caver, a spelunker, I guess, do you have any suspicions? Do you have any kind of good information that there's something going on in the Northeast with regard especially to mountains, whether it's military installations and or some kind of rapid transit for the elite while we might get fried in the hard rain that is going to fall?
Right. That's a good question. And I can tell, the one thing I can tell you is some of these facilities, a good example, Mount Weather, which is located in the Blue Ridge in Virginia, and it's no more than 70 miles west of D.C. There have been tales stories that, in fact, it is connected to DC by a tunnel system of some kind. Now, again, these are stories. I can't vouch for the validity of that, but it's been said. Now, the one thing I can tell you is Mount Weather is, outwardly, this place is supposed to be the headquarters for FEMA. My grandfather worked at Mount Weather. There's a lot more to Mount Weather than just FEMA. I can't really, he never volunteered to us what goes on there. He just simply said, I worked for the government. That's all he said.
Okay.
And, but it's, put it this way, the underground workings there are extensive. Now, there are several of these facilities kind of scattered along the backbone of the Blue Ridge. There's the so-called, we always call it the secret Pentagon that everybody knows where it is.
Yeah, right.
It's called Site R. It's also in the Blue Ridge, in the same kind of rock, which is this greenstone, bluestone, whatever you want to call it. It's a metamorphosed lava, very, 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 very hard. The stuff's almost intractable. You hit it with a rock hammer, it bounces off. And so there's Site R, there's Mount Weather, there's another facility outside of Harper's Ferry that's so secret nobody even knows what it is, but it's it's the usual thing. It's got a gate that says do not enter, under whatever threat of arrest, blah 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 blah. And but these facilities, one of the things I can tell you is to burrow through that rock. In other words, if you were going to build a tunnel system or some kind of mass transportation system or something like that through this stuff, I tell you, it would be a heroic task. You know what I mean?
Yes.
I mean, it would be really, really hard because the rock itself is really, really hard. And so they had pretty much their hands full, I believe, just building the facilities themselves. So I'm not so sure about that. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't do a communications network or something like that. You know what I mean? But as far as physically transporting people, that would be tough. But I'm not saying it would be impossible.
Okay.
But as far as going from the Blue Ridge to D.C., there you could put your tunnels through material, literally through soil if you wanted to. I mean, you don't have to go through rock. And so that's I find that more
plausible.
More plausible.
Yeah, yes. And let's face it also, we know that the DC transportation system, subway system, went out that way. Was a real boon, obviously, to transportation. But I remember when they were doing that. So obviously you have.
They want to push it further now.
Yeah, and if you forgive the pun, I mean it's an above board, real underground transportation system. So it's not unusual that they would extend that. And let's put it this way: if I were to design a place where you would want heads of state to go, you would have them obviously get out of Dodge, but you would have them do it below ground. Mm-hmm. I mean, that makes sense.
Well, and it makes absolute sense. And the thing of, there again, and this is Andy can comment on this as well. I think there's a unifying, and it's not just modern day. I mean, we think of the nightmare scenario of the people go down to the bomb shelter and everything gets wiped out and then they emerge. But that in a larger sense, that imagery, that symbolism of going into the underworld to escape the catastrophe that will scour the earth, and then emerging out of remember what the Sipapu is. That's the point of emergence. That's where in many of the Native American people in the Southwest, that's where the ancestors emerged from the underworld onto the surface. And each time the world is, each time there's a new age, right, they have to go back into the underworld and then reemerge. So this is some kind of there's a unifying thread that runs through this whole thing. And let's face it, the elite, they're aware of this stuff.
Before I throw it to Andrew, I would just interject also, and I'm going to let you have this last say, Andrew, unless Robert gets really mad at me.
No.
But when you think about Orwell in 1984, which was written about 1946 to 1948, talking about boring machines. There is also something we may not have ever been aware of that was well advanced that could make this possible, of course, but not for public consumption. Was Orwell, was Eric Blair guessing right? I don't think so, but obviously that's something to consider because he nailed a number of things in that book within a book in 1984. All right, having said that, Andrew, what about it? I mean, we've talked about it too, what's going on, the strangeness of West Virginia, a lot of which takes place below the surface.
Well, I can just say that last week I interviewed somebody who had I guess you could call it an enlightenment experience at a mound in the Appalachians near the New York-Pennsylvania border. I'm trying to remember now exactly what he got an image. It had to do with raising children. It was something about education. It was like some really interesting point about how we can better raise our children. And I was like, wow. Anyway, I mean, I don't know that much about underground tunnels and stuff. I mean, installation-wise, but.
Well, I think what you're saying is take your kids out of public school and teach them underground.
Yeah. I just thought it was an amazing, and he said, he goes, mounds, kids love mounds, Anytime you see a mound, kids want to get up on top of it. They're drawn to them. There's something about them that people instinctively gravitate towards. And I thought that was a really interesting point. And the other thing I can say is that, and by the way, his interview is going to be in the fourth book, which I'm really getting excited about. I think it's like unbelievably great. Some of the things that have come together in the last few weeks, and it's going to it definitely is going to bring everything together from both east and west witnesses that I've talked to. And the fifth book is going to be about kind of the same issue, but more far out in the sense that I've been talking with a guy who's I can't reveal his name because doesn't really want to go there yet, so we'll see how that all fleshes out. But
okay.
He had listened to some of my shows, and he has these crazy theories about seemingly crazy at first, but then the more he talked about them, the more they seemed to be, I don't know, possible. And he was saying, well, don't you know why Mothman doesn't have a head? And I'm like, I don't know. I never really thought about that. He goes, he's a Garuda, but he had his head cut off. And then he has this whole history of how the Garuda's head was cut off in India centuries ago, and it's been passed through all these cultures and been kept in caves and things. And then I guess his theory is that something exploded over the Earth at one point, whether it was a ship or a comet, or he doesn't really know, and it pierced the Earth in various spots, and the magnetism from this thing has caused certain spots to be opened up that wouldn't normally be, and then also sort of amplifying energies, and that the head of Mothman is being kept in one of these, and that then it gets into all kinds of, I can't endorse the stuff, but I just found it interesting,
sure.
Just sort of synchronous to what we're talking about. He was saying in 2012 with the pole shift that it will change energies enough that more of this kind of thing could happen in the future, where people dream up stuff like they have a hoax and then a bunch of real things occur, or even cartoon characters that people have dreamed up. If people believe in them enough, they may come to fruition. There's like Star Trek churches now. There's some serious Star Trek stuff going on out there.
Wow.
I know somebody that goes to a Star Trek cult of some kind, and he thinks that these creatures could also possibly become larger and possibly more real, like more physical, and predicts some sort of rampage on the part of these creatures. So, well, I don't know, sort of a retribution against, everything that's going on.
Well, and Garuda's looking for his head that ties back into Ichabod Crane, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, that goes back to the killing of Osiris.
Yep.
You kill the king by a head wound, and of course he was cut up into 14 pieces, I believe, 13.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll be some sort of an age. I mean, it's almost like the age of Aquarius thing, that it could be as some new age of some kind.
All right, listen, guys, I'll tell you what. There's things we've not spoken about. There's things probably you'll come up with that you wish you had said, and seeing that is pretty much normal and okay. Whether we do another show together or whether we do them separately, myself with Andrew, myself with Robert, that's all fair game, and I'm sure we'll do that again. And you're most welcome to come back to do that. This has been a pretty quick 2.5 hours, if you can believe we've been on that long, but we have. So what I'll just say for your benefit, just stay with me for a second after I do this farewell. But folks, you've been listening to the Beyond the Grassy Knoll. Now you got me thinking about mounds and and underneath things. Okay, why did I name it that? I don't know. This is Beyond the Grassy Knoll, and we have had with us Robert Denton Jr. and also Andrew Colvin. And again, we're probably going to hear from them again, but we thank you for listening to us, and we'll see you down the road.
Driving me to